I've actually processed deer and even an elk in my apartment, and it's a lot of work, but you might be surprised. It's really not that hard to do. We're going to talk about it today on the Persistence Outdoors podcast. Hey guys, Samuel Allred here. Welcome back to the Persistence Outdoors podcast. We are deep in the middle of hunting season, and hopefully at some point here, you will be successful and you will have the opportunity to process an animal. And you usually have two options. You can bring it to a processor or a butcher, or you can do it at home. And I want to encourage you to try and do it at home this year. I think it's so fun. It's so interesting. And it's sort of one area that I think a lot of hunters don't fully explore. There's a lot of hangups that hunters can have, and processing is one of them. It seems like a complex job. It's going to take a lot of time. Maybe you feel like you don't have room, but I've processed animals in my apartment before, and I've done it by myself. And if I can do it, I think you can do it as well. So we're going to talk about it today, and I'm going to try and shed some light on it as much as I can without showing you an actual video of me cutting meat, right? So I want to start off with a quick story about processing a deer in my apartment. Then we'll talk about why you might want to process an animal yourself. We'll talk about the things you need, breaking down an animal and what the different parts are used for. And then we'll wrap it up with some just general tips for the overall process, pun intended. Before we get into it, if you enjoy this podcast, if you've learned something new, please take a moment to follow the podcast or leave a 5-star review. And if you're feeling generous, please send an episode to a friend. The mission of Persistence Outdoors is to help more people get outside and into hunting. And we all have friends who may be interested in hunting. And so if you know someone like that, send them an episode. And hopefully this podcast can be a great resource for them to start learning about the hunting lifestyle and everything that goes into it, and help them feel confident to go out either hunting with you or hunting on their own. So thank you so much to everybody who supports the podcast, and let's get into our topic for today. All right, so I said I wanted to start out with a story, and this isn't just any story. It's a bit of a tragedy. It involves knives, blood on the floor, loss. I'm probably hyping it up too much, but I'll just get into it. So when I was living in Tennessee, I was hunting the archery season, and I was hunting the archery season with a crossbow. And in the area I was hunting, there were so many deer that you could kill 3 does a day. That was the limit. And so I didn't set my bar very high. I was just out there to kill any deer that came by. Maybe not a fawn or a super small deer, but pretty much any large deer that came by. And so one evening I killed a doe, and I was able to quarter it up, put it all in my backpack, hike it out, and then I put all of the quarters and all the meat I had collected off that animal into my refrigerator. So that's one thing that a lot of people don't know about processing animals, is that oftentimes you can put the entire animal in your refrigerator. And once you get it in your refrigerator, you can just treat it like raw meat. You might have to clear some racks or clear out some food, put something in the freezer. But once you've got it in there, it's the perfect environment. It's very low moisture, right? It's very dry air. It's cool, and it's going to help those quarters stay fresh for a long time. So I put this dough into my refrigerator, and then I decided that I wanted to try processing the animal myself instead of bringing it to a processor. I'd bring other deer two processors before and had a good experience, but I was just curious about it and I figured I could save a little money. So each night after work, I would grab a leg and I took it out. I pulled up YouTube videos on my laptop and I watched the YouTube videos while I was cutting the deer. And I sort of learned which muscles were good for steaks and which were best for grinding, which were best for roasts, whatever. And I was just kind of learning as I went. It took me a long time. It was very slow, but I learned a lot and it was really fun. I thought it was interesting and really enjoyable to do all of that by myself. So eventually I had cut up the whole animal. I had cut up my steaks and vacuum sealed those. I had cut up some roasts and like stew meat, vacuum sealed that. And then I also had a bag of meat to grind. And so it was all my odds and ends, scraps that were still good meat, but that I didn't want to cook as a steak or use in a stew or something else. And I had a friend who had grinding equipment. So I figured, hey, I will freeze this bag. And then when I get a chance, I'll bring it over to his place and we can grind it up and I'll be good to go. So the whole processing in the apartment wasn't too bad. It actually went pretty well and I enjoyed it. The tragedy struck later. So I had all my meat in a big deep freeze. I can't remember how big it was, but it was certainly big enough to hold maybe 4 deer plus some extra frozen foods. And so that was super handy. I put all the meat that I harvested that season into that chest freezer. And so then my wife and I leave town to go visit family for the holidays. And when we left town, I had at least 50 pounds of meat in there. That would be an entire small southern white-tailed deer, and then maybe even some more from a second one. And so we left town, and while we were out of town, there were rolling blackouts in the area that we lived. And I heard about it, and I thought about the meat in the deep freeze, but I understood that they were rolling blackouts, so the electricity should come back on. And once you've got all that meat completely frozen and it's sealed in that deep freeze, it's going to be pretty stable even if you lose power for a couple of hours. So I heard about it, I thought about it, and I figured, hey, the power is going to come back on. It's going to be fine. So my wife and I were off traveling for the holidays, visiting family back in the Northwest. We come back after New Year's and we get in on a very late flight. And we finally get back from the airport to our apartment. It's dark outside. Open the door. And when you open the door, you can smell something's wrong. And we're like, oh no, like this isn't good. And we walk in and then we see on the floor a pool of blood seeping out from under the deep freezer. And at this moment, you're just assuming the worst. You're thinking someone's murdered someone and put a body in our chest freezer. And then you kind of calm down and you think, well, we've got to go check, right? So we go over and open the deep freezer. And thankfully, there was no body in there, but all of the meat had melted and was sitting in that deep freezer without any cooling whatsoever. In fact, it was kind of warm in there. And so there's just a pool of liquid on the bottom of the deep freeze. And then there's 50 pounds of meat at least in there. And then some of the meat, somehow the blood or hemoglobin has seeped out of those packages and it's all blending together and spoiling. And it smelled and looked disgusting. So that was really disappointing. What had happened was the rolling blackouts came and we had the deep freeze plugged into an outlet that had one of those reset buttons on it. And I guess it's a surge protector or something, not really sure. But basically, we would have had to reset that outlet after the blackout. And since we weren't there, there was nobody there to reset that. And so the power never came on for that deep freeze again. And so all of that meat in there was sitting there, insulated, starting to spoil for a week and a half before we got to it. And it was completely unsalvageable by the time we opened it up and took a look. So we cleaned up the blood on the floor. My wife used some hydrogen peroxide, which worked really well, just FYI. And then I took everything out, put it in a trash bag, and then took the deep freeze outside and was like trying to drain it in the grass. And it took a long time to get that thing smelling good again. I had to clean it thoroughly. And then I think I used baking soda to help deodorize it. Then we had to turn it on. I may have had to drain it another time. And then finally, after cleaning it thoroughly multiple times, it stopped smelling so bad. And especially when you had it cold and running, it smelled okay. But for a minute there, I was worried that it was never going to smell okay again. Anyway, I lost an entire deer, the deer that I had spent all the time processing. I lost some other meat as well, and that was pretty disappointing. It was sad to lose, the monetary value of the meat and all the meals that you were going to make out of it. But also, since it was the first deer that I had ever processed, there was a bit of a sentimental value to it as well, I suppose. And that was pretty disappointing. And since then, I've always been much more concerned about my deep freeze and where I plug it in. And I guess it's a good lesson to learn maybe early on before I have like half a cow in a deep freeze or an entire elk in a deep freeze. But it was pretty disappointing. So that's my sad story. But what I want to focus on is the fact that you can process a big game animal in a small space like an apartment. And if you have a house, you likely have even more room to process an animal. What I'm getting at is you can do it at home, and you really don't need a lot of equipment. You don't need a lot of space to be able to do this successfully. So let's talk about why you would want to process an animal at home in the first place. For me, the first reason is to save some money. When you bring an animal to a processor, they are going to charge you a fee. I've had processors that charge a per animal fee. That was in Tennessee where, you have pretty small deer. Other processors are going to charge you a per pound fee for cutting and wrapping. And usually that's going to be the weight of the animal before they've cut it. So not a per pound fee for how much meat you get back, but for the hanging weight of the animal. And that can range from less than $1 per pound to $2 per pound, just depending on where you go. And so all of that can add up. And then if you want anything like fat added to your grind or sausage or jerky, all of that can get pretty expensive, even for a relatively small animal. The next reason why I like processing animals myself is because of the customizability. Now, some processors have a pretty in-depth cut sheet, and you can ask for all sorts of things, but other processors are going to charge an extra fee to do specific things that you want with the animal, and you're kind of at their mercy as far as how they cut everything up. So when you do it, you can choose what becomes steaks, what becomes roasts, what you want to grind, whatever. And I like having a hand in all of that. Another reason why you might do it yourself is because you will know that it's only your animal. Most reputable processors are only going to give you back meat from your animal. But there's been stories of processors combining different animals or you getting back a lot less grind than you expected and someone else getting a lot more. And it's because they didn't do a good job of keeping the animals separate. So if you do it yourself, that's not a problem whatsoever. I also think processing at home is fun. I like doing it. I like cutting the meat and seeing it all go from the entire hind quarter, for example, to something that I would actually eat for dinner or give to a friend, and they could cook it up and they know exactly what to do with it. And you can also do it with other people. And it's kind of a fun opportunity to have some friends over and work on an animal for a couple hours and just get it done right then and there. And then finally, the last reason why I enjoy it and why I would recommend it for other people is the experience in learning. When you process an animal yourself, you get to see it alive in the field, you kill it, you gut it, and then you do every step of the process from seeing it alive to eating it and it being on your plate. And I think that's very valuable. I think a lot of people are disconnected from the meat that they eat, and doing something like that really gives you a new appreciation for meat and a new perspective on really the food chain and even nature and life in general to some degree. So I think processing your own game animals is a great skill to have. Okay, so what kind of things do you need to process an animal? Well, the first thing you need is some cold storage. And this doesn't just have to be like a dedicated walk-in cooler or something. This could be your refrigerator. It could be a chest cooler. It could be a place that you can hang the animal in favorable temperatures, right? If you have a place in your backyard or in your garage that you can hang the animal and the temperatures are in between 33 and 40, 45 degrees, you can hang that animal for quite a while without it spoiling, assuming it gets some airflow and it stays dry. So, some place to keep the animal while you're working on pieces of it. Personally, this was one of the biggest hangups for me that prevented me from processing my own animals before I figured it out. I was thinking, how am I going to keep this thing cool in an apartment? And I came up with all sorts of ideas. I was like, maybe I put it in the bathtub and then put ice in the body cavity. And I was just thinking that through, and I was like, yeah, that's not going to work. My wife's not going to enjoy that. So it wasn't until I realized that I could quarter an animal out, and at that point, it was so small that I could likely fit it in my refrigerator, that it was even an option for me to process an animal at home. I think between a refrigerator and a big cooler, many hunters could have enough cold storage to be able to process their own animals. So think about it. If you're a whitetail hunter, you may be able to fit a whole deer in your refrigerator. If it's a bigger deer or you're hunting mule deer or something like that, you may need a cooler as well. With a recent elk that I was processing, I had to cycle the quarters through my deep freeze, and I had them in there for maybe an hour or two to chill them down, and then pulled them out and put them in a cooler because I didn't have the space in my refrigerator. But I was able to get it done, and it all worked out okay. So the first thing you need is some cold storage. The next thing you need is a knife. This is going to be different than your skinning knife, a different type of blade. Preferably, it's going to be longer and thinner and maybe have some flex in it, like a boning knife. If you don't have a special knife, though, you can use a steak knife. That's what I've used before. You will need a knife sharpener because you're just going to do so much cutting that you're going to have to resharpen the blade. You will also need a cutting board and some room to work. So if it's a big animal, you're going to need some counter space. If it's a deer, even in an apartment, you probably have the space. You'll then need something to put the meat into, right, for freezing. So I recommend a vacuum sealer with vacuum sealing bags. You can get them for not too expensive off Amazon, anywhere from like $50 to $250, just depending on how nice of a vacuum sealer it is. I will say the better vacuum sealers are going to create a tighter seal, and that will help prevent freezer burn on your meat. So if you are going to get a vacuum sealer, you will use it for a long time. It might be worth getting a better one, but I have a pretty cheap vacuum sealer and it usually does the job okay. You can also use plastic wrap and butcher paper. And again, you're going to plastic wrap that meat very tightly to prevent any air pockets and moisture and freezer burn. And then you can use the butcher paper to then wrap it and write what the meat is, what that cut is, and keep it organized in your freezer. You can get a long ways with just those things that I've listed. However, it's also helpful to have some paper towels, some 2-gallon Ziploc bags, and cutting gloves. So the paper towels you can use to clean up messes or dry off meat if it's wet for any reason. The 2-gallon Ziploc bags are great for freezing meat that you're going to grind later. So you might cut up some meat into 1.5 inch or 2-inch cubes and then put it in a 2-gallon Ziploc bag and then freeze that, and you can grind that later when you have the time, or if you want to bring it to a butcher to get it ground. And then finally, a cutting glove is invaluable because once again, you're just doing so much cutting that chances are you're going to nick yourself. And so having a cutting glove for the hand that isn't holding the knife will save you from a lot of small injuries and even big injuries if you're working with a sharp knife. Now, I will say that if you want to grind meat, you will need a meat grinder, and that is specialized equipment. And honestly, I don't have a meat grinder. Instead, what I do is cut up all my meat into cubes, and then I'll bring it to a processor and ask them to grind it. And so I know maybe that's cheating a little bit if you're talking about processing an animal at home, but I think it's the easiest way without actually buying a meat grinder. And if you bring the animal cubed up like that, if you bring the meat cubed up like that, they aren't going to charge you very much just to run it through a grinder and maybe add some fat. So that's what I would recommend if you're thinking about processing an animal at home, but you don't want to invest in a grinder or maybe just don't have space for it. All right, so maybe you make a quick trip to Walmart and you've got everything you need. What's next? Well, you kind of need to understand how the animal is going to break down. So the best way to learn this, to be quite honest, is to look up a YouTube video of it. And there's some great ones out there that show you exactly how to cut apart a hind quarter or a front shoulder or even a full deer that someone has hanging up. But I will give you an overview so you can kind of get an idea of what you're going for. So let's start with the back straps. The back straps are the pieces of meat that are on either side of the spine of an animal. They're usually pretty long and pretty tender. And you are going to get your best steaks from the back straps. Maybe rivaled by the tenderloin, which is the little muscle that's found on the inside of the animal towards its hips. But I actually prefer the back straps a little bit more. I like the texture. So once you pull out those back straps, you can cut those into steaks or medallions, or you can cut the back strap into lengths, freeze it as larger pieces, and then once you're ready to eat it, you can decide what you want to do with it. So there's lots of options, but you should know that's going to be your best source of steaks. I like to cook the tenderloins on most animals whole. Maybe if you had a really, really big animal like a moose, maybe you would want to cut those tenderloins up. But with smaller tenderloins, especially on deer, you can cook those whole, sear them on each of their 3 sides. They're kind of a triangular shape. Sear them, and then you can cut that up into smaller pieces and eat it just the way it is. And I think that is wonderful. With the front shoulders, most of the meat from the front shoulders you are going to use for stew or for grinding. They tend to be pretty tough. And so you can do bone-in roasts where you just cut the front shoulder sort of laterally and go right through the bone. You can, with smaller animals, you can just use the whole top shoulder blade part and make a roast out of that with all the meat that comes with it. You can also cut the meat off the bone and put that in your grind pile. Or you can cut it off the bone and cut it into chunks for stew. But most of that front shoulder is going to work better either ground, so pre-chewed, or in a slow and low cooking style. The hindquarters have a lot of meat on them, and they're a little bit more complex than the front quarter just because there's different textures, like different grains in the meat on the hindquarter, and then also different tenderness levels. So on smaller animals, and especially on younger animals, you may get some steaks from the hindquarter if you like steaks. So you could make the sirloin tip into some steaks. You could make the eye of round into some steaks. You could make the top round into some steaks. Your top round is probably going to be the tenderest part out of all of those. On tougher animals or older animals or even bigger animals, you might not want to use those for steaks. It might not taste as good. It might just not be as tender. And so you might be able to make some kebabs or stir fry with those parts, something that's marinated or cooked quickly, but it may not be as great for steaks. Of course, pretty much any of this meat on the hindquarter you can use to grind, and you can also use a lot of it for stew meat. Generally, with stew meat or something that you're cooking low and slow, you want there to be a lot of connective tissue in there or a lot of fat. And there's not a lot of fat on game animals usually, but there can be a lot of connective tissue. And when you cook it low and slow, like in a crock pot, all that connective tissue will break down and it can actually create a really nice, smooth, sort of silky texture in the meat. And all of that connective tissue is really good for you as well. There's lots of collagen in it. So if you're looking at a hindquarter and you're just trying to get a clue of what muscle groups do I use for what, you can always just take a look and think, okay, is there a lot of connective tissue going through this? That's not going to make a good steak. So I'm going to use that for stew or I'm going to grind it. And then if there's something that doesn't have a lot of connective tissue in it, that might be a clue that it could be used for steak or for something like kebabs or stir fry. If you're interested in jerky, you may want to save the rounds. So there's the top round, which is the most tender in the hindquarter. Then there's the bottom round, and there's also the eye of round. The bottom round is not that tender, and so I would grind it or use it for stew or use it for jerky. Those rounds, though, have a nice long grain, like a nice texture throughout the meat. They don't have too much connective tissue, or you can trim it away. And that nice grain of the meat makes it great for jerky. And the lack of connective tissue means that your jerky will be dry and tough, but it's not going to have stuff that you literally can't chew through in it. So if you want some jerky, consider saving those rounds, setting those aside to bring to a butcher to get some jerky made. One part of the animal that some people throw out is the shank. And the shank is essentially the calf muscle on the hindquarters, or what would be a person's forearm on the front quarters. And these muscles have lots and lots of connective tissue running through them. And often it's not as much meat as further up on the quarters. So some people throw them out. I personally really like them because I will take that meat and I will slow cook it, and all that connective tissue breaks down and leaves you with some really good stew meat. You can also cut it laterally through the bone and make little rounds that have a piece of bone in the middle of them, and use that for a recipe called ossobuco. It's Ossobucco, I believe. And ossobuco is wonderful. It's kind of like a stew. Usually you serve it over polenta and you get the meat with all that silky connective tissue, And then you also get a little bit of that bone marrow in the middle. And I think it's just wonderful. It tastes great. And I highly encourage you not to throw out those shanks. Other things that you can eat that not everybody picks up are the heart, the liver, and then even some other organs like the testicles and kidneys. Out of all of these, the most approachable by far is the heart. I've made heart for multiple people, and I haven't had anybody say they didn't like it yet. It does look a little bit weird when you're cleaning it. It has heartstrings in there, and it has different ventricles and places where veins and arteries attach. But once you cut all of that away and separate it out into some pieces, you essentially just have kind of a strange looking steak. And when you cook that up, you can cook it just like a steak. And everybody who I've prepared it for says it tastes just like good steak. Personally, I don't love heart as much because it has a finer grain texture than other steak, and I'm really sensitive to texture. However, it's good meat, and I will certainly take the heart and eat it, even though it's not my favorite cut from the animal. You can also take the liver. The liver is an interesting organ. I have found that fresh liver can be very good. And when I say fresh liver, I mean within 3 or 4 days of the kill. The sooner the better, quite honestly. And it can be just very mild. It kind of has an earthy taste. It has this soft, almost bready texture. It's just different than meat. I mean, it's not a muscle at all. And so it's its own thing altogether. But liver can be really good. And I actually do like it when it's fresh. When it comes from an older animal, or say a rutted up buck, a animal with like lots of testosterone and adrenaline running through it, it seems to not taste as good. But if it comes from a younger animal or a doe and it's fresh, man, liver is very, very good. So I highly recommend you take some of that as well and give it a try. I've even eaten testicles, and I didn't like those, to be honest, but I would try them again. I cooked them basically whole. I peeled off everything that was like bloody or gross looking, and I cooked them whole, and they have kind of a rubbery outside that's almost like calamari or something, and then the inside is softer like a chicken nugget. So I didn't enjoy the texture of the outside, but I think if I eat testicles again, I would just peel off that rubbery outside and cook whatever's inside. I might even bread it, and then you would basically have a little chicken nugget, and it would be fine. And finally, there's the kidneys and other organs. I have collected the kidneys before and just never gotten around to using them. And I feel like with organs, they're all better when they're fresh. And so I had some kidneys in my refrigerator for like a week, and I just realized I wasn't going to get around to using it because it wasn't a high priority for me. I was thinking about making like a steak and kidney pie or something, and eventually threw them out. So if you want, you can mess around with the kidneys. If you're going to grab anything that's not just muscle meat, try the heart and try the liver first. Okay, so that's kind of an overview of all the different parts of the animal. If that sounds complicated, remember this: if it looks like meat, it's good to eat. Really, there's hardly anything on the animal besides maybe the entrails or maybe the brain or spoiled meat that is going to hurt you. So if you've got meat and it's clean and it smells good and it looks like muscle meat, like a steak you would buy from a store, it's probably good to eat. And even all those little scraps that you cut off, you can put that in a pile and grind it up, and you're going to have a perfectly edible product. So once again, if it looks like meat, it's good to eat. And there might be some trial and error involved. You might decide to grind most of the animal because you're not sure what's tender and what's not. You can look up some YouTube videos and quickly figure out what's tender and what's not. And I think you'll be able to do it. So don't be shy, get in there and start cutting. When you're cutting, you are going to want to cut some things away. So anything that looks gunky in there, like connective tissue or sometimes fat in there, you're going to want to trim that away. Now, fat in meat isn't going to hurt you. You can definitely eat fat from wild animals. Most people say it doesn't have as pleasant of a taste as beef fat, and it doesn't keep as well, and it doesn't have as nice of a texture. So most people are going to trim that away. Personally, I haven't killed animals that had a whole lot of fat on them to mess around with. So I generally just trim off the small parts of fat that I do find. You also want to trim away any bloodshot meat or meat with bone fragments. Anything from around the shot that's like clearly bruised or has foreign material in the meat, trim that away. All that bloodshot meat and the bruising and the laceration of the tissue just invites spoilage. And so you want to cut that away as soon as possible, and you definitely don't want to eat it. When you get in there, you will likely find some congealed blood from the wound. So cut that away, get that out. You don't want that taste in your grind. If there's anything that's soiled, dirty, hairy, cut that away. If the meat smells bad or is the wrong color, cut that away. It's a sign of spoilage. I mean, a lot of this is pretty intuitive. If it's something that you wouldn't want to eat, cut it away, right? There is one exception, and that's silver skin. So silver skin is a connective tissue that runs throughout muscles. And before you eat the meat, usually you want to cut that away unless you are slow cooking it. But when you're freezing it, silver skin can help protect the meat from freezer burn. So if you have a piece of backstrap, for example, that has silver skin on it, you might leave that silver skin on while you're freezing the meat and then cut it away when you defrost it and are actually preparing it for a meal. So you don't always want to cut away all the silver skin because it can be helpful to protect the meat from freezer burn. Another thing I think I should mention here is the rind on the meat. If you've cooled your meat down and you have it in some game bags, and maybe you have it hanging somewhere, or even if you don't have it in game bags, you just have the entire animal hanging with the hide off, chances are the outside of the meat is going to dry out a little bit and form a rind. And this is actually a good thing because it helps protect the rest of the meat from spoilage. It makes it a little bit harder for other things like moisture and dirt to permeate that rind and spoil the meat. So this is a good thing. Most people will cut away that rind though when they're processing the animal, and you'll lose a little bit of meat, but it's generally worth it to keep that meat from spoiling in the first place. So you might have noticed I've recommended cutting away a lot of the animal. And so you might ask, how much meat am I actually going to get from this? And a rule of thumb is that you will get about a third of the live weight of the animal. So if the animal weighed 150 pounds, you are likely to get about 50 pounds of meat once it's been cut, deboned, and wrapped for your freezer. So it's surprising to some people how little meat comes off of an animal, but once you take the guts out, take the hide off, cut away bloodshot meat, silver skin, fat, whatever you want to cut away, then it kind of makes sense that there's only about a third of the animal left, and that's what you're going to eat. Okay, here's a few tips to keep in mind while you're cutting. So the first, like I've mentioned before, is to go watch a YouTube video. Even if you don't spend a lot of time watching a YouTube video, it will help you visualize what's actually going on, and I think it will make it a lot more accessible to you. So just watch someone do it for a minute and you'll get an idea of what they're doing, what they're cutting away, and then how you can take an animal like a hind quarter or something and to actually make it into an edible product. My next tip is to let the meat cool on the bone if you can. If you can, let it go through rigor mortis while the whole hindquarter or even the whole animal is still together, instead of cutting that bone out or cutting the meat out so soon after killing the animal that it shrinks up in muscle groups, but without any bone to hold it in place. And letting the animal go through rigor mortis and cool while on the bone will keep it stretched out and will actually help improve the quality of the muscle meat. Those muscle groups are going to stay extended even as they contract. They're going to stay extended, and then once rigor mortis passes, they will loosen up again and they're still stretched out on that bone. That's going to be a much better product than meat that is cut off the bone, goes through rigor mortis and contracts, but then never stretches out again. So if you can, let the meat cool on the bone and go through that entire natural process of contracting and loosening up again. Another tip is to follow the seams. When you're looking at an animal, it's actually pretty fascinating because you can see all of the different muscle groups and how they fit together. And when in doubt, you can just start cutting along the seams. So you'll have a place where two different muscle groups push up next to each other, and down the middle, there will be some connective tissue. Well, just start cutting away down the middle where that connective tissue is, and likely those muscle groups are going to come apart. And then you have big chunks of muscle with less connective tissue that you can choose what to do with. With a hindquarter, for smaller animals like deer, you can sometimes even just grab it and start pulling, and you can actually pull apart the hindquarter at the seams, and then you'll have these different primal cuts that you can then choose to cut into cubes for stew, or cut into steaks, or put in your grind pile. But it really is pretty intuitive to some degree. You just look at where the muscles are and follow the seams and start your cutting there. Another tip is to keep the meat dry. I made a little bit of a mistake with an animal I was processing recently. It wasn't disastrous, but it could have been better. So I decided to take this big hindquarter and cut it into primal cuts, so just the big muscle groups, and then put it into Ziploc bags and put it in my refrigerator. And then I was going to come back to those muscle groups and break them down even further. And this was kind of a good idea because I was consolidating and getting some of these big hindquarters out of my cooler and into my refrigerator. The problem was some of these muscle groups were a little bit wet, and then I put them in a Ziploc bag so there was no airflow, and put them in the refrigerator, and they're kind of just sitting in their own juices. And a couple of those Ziploc bags started to smell not so great. It's kind of like a vinegary smell. And I was like, oh, it's starting to get close to spoiling. It wasn't too bad. I mean, I cut away a little bit of meat and thankfully didn't lose anything, but it would have been better if I could have kept those muscle groups dry or had some airflow, like maybe even didn't seal those Ziploc bags, or left them on the hindquarter where they weren't just sitting in their own juices and potentially spoiling. So as much as you can, keep that meat dry. You also don't want to freeze the meat before you've cut it up if you can avoid it, because freezing the meat is going to make it contract and lose moisture. And then once it defrosts, it's going to loosen up again. And that freezing and loosening up again is going to make the quality of the meat not quite as good. So if you can, keep the meat unfrozen until you're ready to freeze it for long-term storage. And then finally, don't be afraid to grind some meat. If you're unsure about a certain cut, you can always grind it and then you can eat it. And there's pretty much nothing that's going to be bad ground, unless it's just excessive connective tissue, right? But ground meat is super easy to use. So rather than fretting over whether this is going to be a perfect steak or perfect stew meat, you can just grind it and you will have a perfectly edible and very useful product. All right, guys. Well, I'm close to wrapping this up, but before I do, I want to touch on visiting a butcher. And I'm kind of using a butcher or a processor interchangeably here. Sometimes you are going to cut up your entire animal and then you're going to have a grind pile, or you really want to make some jerky, or you want to get some sausages made, and you just don't have the equipment to do that. And so at that point, it's a good idea to take some of your prepped meat to a butcher. Now, you still saved money. It's still worth doing most of the work yourself, but sometimes there's just specialized things that are harder to do without specialized equipment. So when you're bringing meat to a butcher, it's a good idea to call ahead and see what they accept. Some butchers and processors have different requirements. For example, a processor near me has a minimum for making jerky. So they say you can only bring in at least 10 pounds of meat if you want jerky. Other butchers in town aren't going to accept wild game at all. And still other butchers are going to have specific requirements about how it's presented. Like maybe they want it in a cooler, or maybe they want it in game bags, whatever. So just call ahead and figure that all out before you waste a trip. Another good thing to do is weigh your meat before you bring it to the butcher. This way you can make sure that the butcher's on the up and up and you get back about as much as you sent them. Obviously, if they are doing something with it, like making jerky, it's going to shrink down. Or if they're grinding it, maybe they're going to add some fat. But it's a good idea to have a ballpark of how much you brought to them so you can make sure that you're getting what you paid for. All right, guys, that's all for today. I hope this has been helpful for you and that you have a chance to try processing an animal at home. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out by sending an email to persistenceoutdoors2022@gmail.com or leaving a comment in the Spotify or YouTube comments, and I'll do my best to get you an answer. With that, I will wrap this up. Have a great week, everybody, and I will catch you on the next one.